Jim Jatras, former US diplomat. Many thanks for joining us on the programme. It's good to see you. So the big news of the day, Mr. Jatras, Donald Trump threatening to impose 100% tariffs on Russia and those it does business with if a peace deal is not reached within 50 days. Your reaction, please.
Well, thank you, Nikki. Well, we haven't quite reached the level of Biden light in the Trump administration, but we're pretty close to it. I think we have to look at this, that, the hopes early on many people had there was going to be a deal with the Russians or a peace agreement or a grand bargain. That was never going to happen. He was always steering back toward a demand for a ceasefire. That's what he's been very consistent on in the last few months. And he really thinks that, the art of the deal, he can bluster and threaten and force the Russians to conform to what would amount to be a kind of a Minsk III kind of a deception deal. I don't think the Russians are dumb enough to fall for that, but that is where American policy is. I think he's clearly signaling that he's going to accept the big beautiful sanctions bill from hell from Senators Graham and Blumenthal. And of course, this is going to come with, some very flexible waiver authority of the president. So he'll be in a position to impose whatever sanctions he wants, anytime he wants, against any country he wants.
Is there any particular reason why he's said 50 days? It's not a month, it's not 2 months, it's 50 days. Seems like such a specific time. What do you think?
Yeah. That's the thought that occurred to me, too. You normally expect 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, something like 50 days. What's the deal with that? I think there are a couple of things there. Let's remember that the Ukraine war is simply one theater of a global war now between essentially the American-led, what do we want to call it, camp against the Eurasia, particularly the BRICS. You notice the countries that are being targeted specifically by Senator Graham are India, Brazil, and China. In other words, the other core members of the BRICS. So I think what they have in mind is something that has to do with probably the resumption of the war between Israel and the United States and Iran after the Israelis build up their weapons stocks, and probably something to do with the likelihood of when they will impose the snapback sanctions on Iran. So I think they're looking at a bigger Eurasian picture here than just vis-a-vis Russia.
So which countries do you think will be taking note now? Which countries are going to be potentially hit the most by these so-called secondary sanctions?
Well, I think China is pretty much invulnerable to these sanctions. We're already in a sanctions and tariff war with China. I think the big targets right here are Brazil and India. Brazil is probably much more vulnerable than India is. India, obviously they've been trying to straddle the fence. They still play silly games with the so-called Quad with the United States and Japan and Australia as an anti-Chinese alliance. But they're not foolish enough to become the juggernaut in a war against China. The Brazilians are much more, they after all are in the Western Hemisphere. They're in a much more delicate position regarding their trade relationship with the United States. I think they're actually going to be the most vulnerable target to be singled out by Trump, especially since he's got a little bit of a feud between him and President Lula over the criminal accusations against President Bolsonaro.
Could it just be big talk at this point, though? 50 days is quite a long time for people to change their minds on things. It could be just smoke and mirrors, thinking that... I'm wondering whether Washington has the economic clout to deal with the consequences of imposing sanctions on such major players of global trade.
No, we don't. I mean, it would be cutting off our nose to spite our face, as a lot of his tariff policies have been in terms of what impact they have domestically on prices in the United States and on the American economy. And these would be far, far worse if he actually uses all the authority given to him. We also have to look, by the way, at what the other part of the discussion today is, that we're going to be giving more weapons to Ukraine, supposedly, or rather selling more weapons to the Europeans so they can give them to the Ukrainians. But that hides the fact that neither we nor the Europeans have the military-industrial capacity to produce a whole lot of weapons that will make the difference. I think at the bottom line, this throws the ball back into Moscow's court. Are they still going to be playing this careful, restrained game in the hopes that there will be a deal down the line somewhere, or does it finally occur to them that there is no deal, there will be no deal? The only solution to this is militarily, and restraint at this point is not the cautious path. It's actually the incautious path that stimulates more recklessness from Washington and our partners. Let's face it, right now, Trump is on the same page as Lindsey Graham and Mr. Rutte over at NATO.
Yeah. A few days ago, Germany said it was going to be sending long-range missiles to Ukraine, which will be arriving by the end of the month. Now, Trump says the Patriots will be there within a matter of days. How much of a game changer will this be for the conflict?
Militarily, they won't be much of a game changer, and that they can't help the Ukrainians win. They're meant to be pedagogical to induce the Russians to come to some sort of a bad truce ceasefire type agreement, because they might fear that if they don't do so, there will be an escalation that will get out of control. Remember, there's been loose talk in Washington too about a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which would put NATO forces into direct conflict with the Russians. The Russians would rather not have that. The question is in avoiding that, do they see that as reason to exercise more caution, or rather to speed up whatever timetable they have in mind?
Meanwhile, the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, who was there with Trump when he made this announcement, who famously called Trump daddy just a few weeks ago, has heaped more praise on America. He said the US is the world's policeman, and he's happy that the EU is going to pay for these American weapons. Let's take a listen to what he said exactly.
The US needs also to keep the whole world safe, because in the end you are the police agent of the whole world. You're the most powerful nation on earth, the most powerful military on earth. But given that, the US has decided to indeed massively supply Ukraine with what is necessary through NATO. Europeans 100% paying for that. And what we have been doing over the last couple of days is talking with countries, and I just mentioned the ones who in the first wave immediately said, we want to chip in.
Yeah, why do you think Washington is suddenly so generous? Has all this praise really won Trump over?
Yeah, I think it has actually, and I'm not sure that was that strong of a push anyway. Obviously, they got his number in terms of what appears to be a kind of a narcissistic personality. And I've always said that the European Union is just NATO's concubine anyway, so I suppose that gives this daddy expression a whole new depth of meaning. The fact is, I think a lot of this talk that people were pointing to earlier on, that, the Europeans in Kiev are on one side, but Trump is on the other side. I think a lot of that was just smoke and mirrors. It was a Punch and Judy show to play good cop, bad cop with the Russians. They were always on the same page as far as I'm concerned. Now it's just something the mask is coming off.
Europe's already struggling financially. Where on earth are they going to get the money to pay for these new weapons?
That's an interesting question, because the only thing that was really keeping the European economy afloat, and particularly the German, economic miracle, was cheap energy from Russia. That's all gone. We can shake them down for, whatever energy we're selling them. We can try to cut off their bootleg energy from Russia via India and so forth, which is what Mr. Graham and others are talking about. I don't know where they're going to get the money. All this talk about pressing them into, increasing their spending into 5% of GDP, declining GDP as it seems. I don't think is going to go much of anywhere, but that does seem to be the American game plan. We will make the weapons, even though we don't have the industrial capacity. The Europeans will buy them with whatever money they can come up with, and then give them to the Ukrainians, who will continue to die in vast numbers. It's a recipe from hell.
Yeah, sanctions on Russia so far haven't reaped the benefits that Europe and America hoped they would. What possible threats do you see coming from the American president if this latest threat doesn't follow through?
I don't know, Nikki. It seems that these people have an endless kind of a dysgenic imagination, where they can come up with all sorts of things that won't work, but do threaten escalation and are damaging to everybody involved, especially their own economies, especially the European economy. And of course, the death toll that it's taking in Ukraine, and to a great extent in Russia as well. And, I think I can't emphasize this enough. The longer this war goes on, the more these people will come up with all sorts of imaginative, destructive initiatives to try to. They can't win this war anymore. I think they know that, but their hope is not to lose. That somehow, through threatening, to march up right to the edge of a nuclear Armageddon, they can finally get the Russians to sign on the dotted line on a freeze, a truce, a ceasefire that they know cannot hold, just like the truce between Israel and the United States in Iran cannot hold.
So what kind of official response do you think we can expect from Russia?
I think the Russians will play it cool. They'll be unimpressed. They will obviously be not happy with these developments. They will talk more about their willingness to negotiate and about maintaining dialogue with their partners and so forth, even though I think they understand that that dialogue can go nowhere. What they will actually do about it at this point, I don't know. It really comes down to events on the ground in Ukraine. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, American hardliners, as you were saying, such as Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, have insisted on supplying Ukraine with arms despite the ongoing peace talks. And now Donald Trump says he'll do exactly that, despite having a different stance initially. Who's really running Washington?
Well, that's the thing, too. I think a lot of people came, when Trump came into office, they had this idea, okay, there's the new sheriff in town. He promised us no more wars. He promised us he's going to make America great again. He promised us all these things. He didn't really do much of that during his first term, but there were still a lot of true believers who said, "Okay, well, he learned his lessons. He's learned how to where all the skeletons are really buried in Washington." And then it turns out in his second term, it works out no better. Oh well, those Epstein files, they really don't exist either. Oh well, I wanted to make a peace deal with the Russians, but the Russians are being stubborn and they're just killing lots and lots of people. So let's just go down the same tired road of the Biden administration. I think that the way Trump is behaving, aside from his personal impulsiveness and narcissism, is a ratification of those who say that there is a permanent government in Washington, there is a swamp, there is a deep state, and whether he's doing it willingly or unwillingly, Trump has become little more than the glove on the hand of the deep state. And it's a sad fact that I think the American system is so thoroughly broken that neither Trump nor anybody else can fix it. He's like a wheel attached to the axle, and all he can do now is spin.
Yeah, a lot of disenchanted Trump fans these past few weeks. Many thanks for speaking to us today. Really good to hear from you, as always. Jim Jatras, former US diplomat. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki.